Dr. Kahleová, I want to turn to you now. We've referenced the year 1918 on a couple of occasions. The Physicians Committee hasn't been around quite that long, but nonetheless, this was a very momentous year in terms of us really gaining an understanding about global pandemics. That was the year of the H1n1 pandemic. And I understand that you have recently spent a lot of time looking back at what occurred more than a century ago, and you may have stumbled on a very interesting link, something that we've really known for more than a century now, but is not yet getting discussed.
Thank you, Chuck. Yeah, exactly. When we're looking for solutions for the COVID-19 pandemic, there are some important lessons from the Spanish flu pandemic in 1918 to 1919. Although there are some differences between the two of them, the COVID-19 seems to be spreading more quickly, but the mortality rates seem to be lower. Both of these are respiratory infections caused by a virus, and the human population hasn't developed any pre-existing immunity against those. Let's look into the similarities. I'll share my screen with you and start the presentation. Can you see the screen?
We absolutely can. And if you're listening back to this on Apple Podcast or on Spotify, please know that we have posted this presentation in its entirety over at pcrm.org/podcast. You can also find a link to it directly in the show notes for this episode.
So what are the lessons that we can learn from the Spanish flu pandemic? The Spanish flu was the H1n1 influenza that lasted for more than a year, from 1918 to 1919. About 500,000 people, that's 1/3 of that world's population, was affected, and 50 million deaths are estimated. Something special about the Spanish flu was that not only elderly population was affected, but also the population in the productive age between 20 and 40 years. And we are still looking into the factors that may have played a role. When looking into the Spanish flu, there's an interesting report that I found fascinating. It reads, "Seminary cinches flu. Hutchinson Institution makes a record combating disease. 120 exposed, 90 patients, no deaths, none very sick." Let's read the article, which is super short. On the authority of Dr. Fred Shepard, a health officer of Hutchinson City, it may be stated that no public institution in the state of Minnesota has up to date made a record in handling influenza, the worldwide epidemic that has swept millions into their graves, like that to the credit of the Hutchinson Seventh-day Adventist Seminary. The seminary, with 120 of its 180 students and teachers housed under one roof, which is a complete disaster, of course, for a pandemic, and that's why we have social distancing, right, to avoid quick spreading like this, was invaded by the malady 3 weeks ago. Symptoms of the malady developed with some 90 of these. And under the direction of Dr. Larson, a graduate physician, member of the seminary faculty, every person showing indication of sickness was at once put to bed, with a trained nurse taking temperature and watching for symptoms of the epidemic. If those symptoms developed, the patient was required to remain in bed. There were no drugs to be given, but with complete rest and quiet, went a carefully regulated diet, which we know was a plant-based diet based on grains, fruits, vegetables, and nuts, and fomentations that's hot towels applied to the throat, chest, and abdomen. This treatment, in almost every case, reduced the temperature of patients, and in a day or so, they were apparently well. One reason why the mortality from Spanish flu was so high in the population and in the productive age may be the use of aspirin to reduce the temperature, which might have impaired the immune response, but also masked the symptoms, and that's why people were not staying in bed and getting the rest they needed. They might have dealt with the infection belatedly. So it seems like getting enough bed rest was one of the crucial components. But a plant-based diet was not only able to help them overcome the viral infection, but was also addressing boosting the immune system in other ways, and also addressing the underlying chronic diseases that might have been present. But that did not end the matter with them. The next danger was that of relapse. To guard against this, every patient was required to remain abed from 2 to 5 days after apparent full recovery, according to the state of their flu affliction. As a result of this system of handling a disease that is scoring thousands of victims every day, there has not been one case that could have been called serious or a single death in the seminary, although there were more than 90 persons affected. The record is remarkable. It makes the ordinary method of dealing with the flu appear irrational. And we are indeed thankful to God for his protecting care and for the untiring efforts of Sister Knudsen, our seminary nurse, and for the assistance of the other nurses and helpers. The hydrotherapy treatments, under the blessings of God, are indeed helpful, as is recognized by this article.
Well, Dr. Kahleová, let me jump in here for a second. This article, again, was published in December of 1918. So this is many, many years ago. And although the coronavirus COVID-19, the pandemic that we're currently going through, it is far too new to have a full grasp of effective treatments and nutrition, but one can certainly draw a parallel based off of what you have unearthed with this article and what that research showed back then with the importance of eating the plant-based diet, correct?
That's correct. So in the report, there seem to be three key components of the treatment. The first is a plant-based diet. The second one is bed rest and getting enough sleep. And the third one was hydrotherapy as a way of handling the fever. So we can look into all of these components. But let me also say that even this report is no guarantee that if we follow these instructions exactly to the T, we will not get the coronavirus or we will not get any complications. I also found another report that was comparing this approach with an approach from the US military. And the comparison is pretty remarkable as well. We can see that in the US Army, there was getting better outcomes than in the rest of the country. About 17.7% of the ones that were afflicted by influenza developed pneumonia, and 6.7% died of influenza. While in the Adventist sanitariums, the risk of developing pneumonia was 7 times lower, and the risk of death was 5 times lower. So again, a plant-based diet in combination with handling the fever and getting enough rest was also contributing to much better outcomes on a larger scale, not only in one institution, but these are outcomes from 10 sanitariums in the US. from the same time period.
That's pretty remarkable research. I think that a lot of people watching this right now may be wondering, well, we hear so much about a plant-based diet being anti-inflammatory. Is there a connection between inflammation and respiratory diseases?
Yeah, that's a great question. It has been shown that vegetarians have lower inflammatory markers like C-reactive peptide, CRP. So definitely a plant-based diet seems to be anti-inflammatory, but there's also other components that go into this. Let me just review briefly the hydrotherapy and handling the fever. This was the only method back then before aspirin came to the market, and it seems to be an effective way how to boost the immune system even today, while handling fever with hot towels over the chest was important to boost the immune cells and the white blood cells locally and increase the temperature locally. When we are not sick, the opposite is true. Taking cold showers may boost our immune system. And randomized clinical trials in the Netherlands has shown that taking short, brief cold showers every day may reduce the sickness absences by 29%. So that's hydrotherapy. We can use water to prevent illness and also to treat it. Another important component was also getting enough rest and enough sleep. One randomized clinical trial that included 25 healthy young men who got their flu shot randomized them into one half of the men were sleep deprived, were getting only 4 hours of sleep a night versus normal sleep. And the antibody titers were less than half in sleep-deprived men. And we produce antibodies against viral infections either after vaccination or when we encounter the virus. So it doesn't make any big difference. Obviously, we want to be able to produce as many antibodies as possible. So it seems like getting enough sleep is one of the crucial components in our lifestyle, what we can do to boost our immune system and its ability to defend us against the viral infections. Another study was in 153 healthy men and women. And the study was tracking the sleep duration and efficiency measured as the amount of time actually asleep when you're in bed, and also how refreshed you feel in the morning. And the researchers administered a rhinovirus into their nose, and they were following the study participants for a few days. Those who were reporting shorter duration of sleep, less than 7 hours, were 3 times more likely to develop cold than those who were sleeping 8 hours or more. And those with a low sleep efficiency were 5.5 times more likely to develop cold versus those who reported an efficient sleep. So that was hydrotherapy, getting enough rest. And now we're getting into the plant-based diet part. Why would a plant-based diet?
Can I jump in there for 1 second there? I think a lot of us are seeing that and say, well, less than 7 hours. I feel like I'm doing pretty good if I get 5 or 6. And so we really do need that full 8 hours sleep, it appears.
Yeah, 1 in 3 Americans is sleep deprived. So this is a message that we need to hear.
No kidding.
This is a knowledge that we need to implement. Let's jump into the plant-based diet. Why would a plant-based diet improve your immune function?
Before we go forward, let me just jump in real quick, if you don't mind, just because I think it's important for people to understand that these findings from 102 years ago are fascinating. And yet at the same time, it's important that we acknowledge this was not a randomized clinical trial. this was simply an observation. It also was not the same virus. It wasn't COVID-19. It was influenza A. So we really don't know if this is going to apply to COVID-19. We can't really be sure of that. And especially, I want people to not, I'm sure nobody would think that this doesn't mean we don't do all of the normal precautions, like hand washing and social distancing. These things are as important as ever. And if a person's sick, you need medical care just as much as ever. So with those cautions, I would say that nonetheless, these findings were quite remarkable because the similarities are also very important. This was a viral illness to which humans hadn't had prior exposure. So they had really no immunity. And that's why these conditions were so devastating. I mean, the one in 1918 and the one that we have now in 2020. And the fact of the matter is we don't have a treatment for it. All the treatments we have are supportive. So people back then had the same tools that we have now. The difference perhaps is that diets at that time were in many ways much simpler. And there were people who had meaty diets, and then in the Adventist seminary, they just, for whatever reason of their own, religious reasons, I guess, said that's not what we're going to have. And they had these very simple diets of vegetables and fruits and so forth with none of the junk that people are eating now. And so as a result, it was associated with a much better outcome. We can't say it was a cause and effect. Was it something else? Who knows? But as reluctant as a person, I think, should be to simply take these findings on face value, I don't think we should. At the same time, I think it's a mistake to just discount things like this and see, is there a lesson in there that we could learn and could test today? So anyway, with that preface, back to you, Hana, about the modern science of nutrition and immunity.
Thank you, Neil. So is there any science on plant-based nutrition and immune system and viral infections? One randomized clinical trial that included 83 healthy volunteers at the age of 65 to 85 compared a low fruit and vegetable intake, less or equal to 2 portions a day, with a high fruit and vegetable intake, 5 portions a day or more. And they were following the participants for 16 weeks. At week 12, the participants got their tetanus shot and also their pneumovax vaccine. And it's remarkable that the antibodies, that the antibody production was almost twice higher in those with a high fruit and vegetable consumption. And again, you produce antibodies after a shot, but also when you actually encounter the virus. So you want your antibody production to be as high as possible. So fruit and vegetable consumption seems to be crucial. Why is that? We've known for many years that antioxidants like vitamin C, for example, is able to boost our immune system and its ability to produce antibodies. But I also discovered another mechanism, and that's nitric oxide. Nitric oxide is a signaling molecule that's produced within our body, and it's produced by an enzyme that's called intrinsic nitric oxide synthase. And it has many beneficial effects in our body, mainly cardiovascular. And interestingly, it has also inhibitory effects on some virus infections, including influenza. And our intrinsic nitric oxide synthase is upregulated during an infection. And interestingly, this enzyme inhibits the replication cycle of the coronavirus specifically. So the nitric oxide is toxic to the coronavirus. And now, are there any ways how we can boost the production of nitric oxide? Are there any foods that may help increase the nitric oxide synthesis in our body? The answer is yes. All fruits and vegetables do that. They increase our nitric oxide synthesis. However, some foods do it more efficiently than others. So dark leafy greens do it more efficiently. So arugula and spinach and red beets and lettuce. All these are super beneficial for your nitric oxide synthesis and will boost your immune functions even better than other foods. So this is something we can all do, include the leafy greens on an everyday basis. And it seems that some foods may also have antiviral properties. One study that was a randomized clinical trial and included 146 participants compared a garlic supplement, 180 milligrams of allicin that corresponds to about 2 to 3 cloves of garlic a day, to placebo, and was following the participants for 12 weeks. And this study showed that garlic reduced the risk of getting common cold about 3 times and also reduced the sick days 3 times compared to placebo. And so it seems like, again, it's not against coronavirus. This is against common cold. So it seems to be working well against viral infections in general. We don't know exactly if it's going to protect us against coronavirus specifically. But there seem to be some antiviral properties in some foods. One of them is garlic. There's also some research on ginger and resveratrol that's in grapes and peanuts and strawberries and blueberries. So it seems like some plant foods have the ability to protect us against viral infections even more effectively. And it's important to note that most of the pandemics and the superflus occur during winter months when we get less sun exposure. So it's important to think about our vitamin D supplementation, which has been widely recommended. However, 95% of Americans are vitamin D deficient. So this is something we need to think about. Vitamin D prevents acute respiratory tract infections, and a meta-analysis of 25 randomized clinical trials has shown that vitamin D reduces the risk of respiratory tract infections by 12%. So if you don't get enough sunlight, get enough vitamin D from your supplement.
Can I jump in there and ask either you, Dr. Barnard, or you, Dr. Kahleová? I know that at least one listener recently has written in and asked about vitamin D. Apparently, there's been some controversy about vitamin D supplementation of late. Have either of you heard of this? The controversy?
I'm happy to jump in, and then Hana, you might have some other things. I should say that vitamin D has always been controversial because it's a fat-soluble vitamin, meaning like other fat-soluble vitamins, you can overdose on it and it could hurt you. If you had too much of it, it could theoretically kill you eventually, although you'd have to really work at it. But what that has meant is that doctors have long debated about what's the right amount. And its natural source is sunlight. And if people aren't getting regular sunlight, which most people are not, then supplementing up to about 2,000 international units a day, most doctors would say that's okay. But that number has been very controversial. The risks of it are controversial. At what point is too much going to be a problem? Is testing appropriate? And I think, Dr. Kahleová, you're the expert on this, but my guess is that most people would say that testing is appropriate, despite the fact that almost everybody comes out low, and so people tend not to believe the test. My sense is that testing is worthwhile, and that if people are low, that it is useful to supplement. And there are probably a couple of benefits. The main benefit is that the benefit people know about is it helps you absorb calcium from your foods. It also seems to have an anti-cancer effect, although that remains controversial too. The evidence for it is not slam dunk, but it looks like higher vitamin D levels reduce cancer risk some. And then adding on to this, the idea that there might be some immune boosting and an antiviral effect is new needs to be explored more, just as all of these things. But at the same time, the evidence there is certainly intriguing.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. Most people will get some benefits from the supplements, and you can always check your levels during your regular checkup. It's a good vitamin to check.
And, you know, it should be said, I think, if this was kind of implicit in your question, Chuck, everything that we're talking about here, whether it's resveratrol or garlic or anything, we at the Physicians Committee are not selling any of these things. We're not necessarily clear on what is even on whether these are beneficial or not. I think, as Dr. Kahleová said very clearly, this is not COVID research. These are people who have been looking at other viruses over time. They've taken time to test them, to test various things, and bringing forward this evidence is simply an important way to look at what might be helpful against COVID. So if you're already washing your hands and you're already socially distancing, you're thinking, what the heck else can I do? Because so many people are doing those things, are still getting sick. The question is, will my diet help? And the answer is, we don't know. But there is plenty of reason to think that diet does affect at least some viruses, the common cold virus, the influenza virus, other kinds of viruses. So let's test these, because if there's a way that we can reduce what doctors would call the mortality and the morbidity, that means the sickness and death that comes from these things, if foods could help, we want to make sure that we are not neglecting that possibility and are at least talking about what we know and hopefully encouraging people to, researchers to test these things.
Dr. Kahleová, is there anything else with your presentation that you'd like to add?
Yeah, I completely agree with Dr. Barnard. And, you know, the case mortality is only 0.9% in those who don't have any comorbidities for coronavirus. However, it's 10.5% for those who have cardiovascular disease. So the benefit of adopting a plant-based diet right now is not only to protect yourself against the coronavirus, you know, which we don't know exactly how much it will help you, but it's even more helping you to address the underlying disease, and this way it may help you even more in the long term.
All right. Well, Dr. Kahleová, thank you so much for that presentation. If you wouldn't mind ending the share screen so we can come back up full screen for everybody. That was really interesting, dating all the way back to 1918, how long we've known about the importance of nutrition when it comes to fighting off viruses. And it is no coincidence that I think Seventh-day Adventists were the ones who were followed for that particular research. And that particular group has continued to be very, very just invaluable in terms of nutrition research for many, many years, going to the Adventist Health Study too, even. So interesting stuff. Again, we're going to post the full presentation up for you on pcrm.org/podcast, as well as a link to it in the episode notes below if you're listening to this on Apple Podcast or on Spotify, wherever it is that you get your audio from. That's where you can find the exam room.